environmental issues for more than 20 years. I avoided climate change for the longest time because it's such a black hole. Finally, 5 or 6 years ago, I realized I couldn't avoid it any longer, so I jumped in with both feet and got sucked into the vortex. I don't want to get too far off into the weeds of the issue, except to say two things. One is, I think most of you either have followed or heard about scandals of last fall known as ClimateGate. What found with over 1,000 emails and 100,000 pages of technical documents from one of the key nodes in the whole climate world. And what it revealed was not pretty. It was highly embarrassing to the climate community. It revived some old arguments about the so-called hockey stick that purported to prove human-caused climate change in the latter half of the 20th century. I think it's sort of a Humpty-Dumpty moment. I think the climate campaign is not going to recover from this. The analogy I've used is that the ClimateGate emails are for the climate change debate what the Pentagon Papers were for the Vietnam War debate back in 1970. Something that completely changed the narrative of the issue, probably forever. But even before that moment came along, I always thought that in the fullness of time, we would look back on climate change, let's say fullness of time, 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, we look back on climate change the way we now look back on the population bomb of the late 60s. The problem with the population bomb wasn't that it was completely wrong. I mean, we did more than double the world population in the space of a century. That presented large environmental and political and social problems around the world. However, the magnitude of the problem was vastly overestimated by people like Paul Ehrlich and the United Nations, who set up a big program for this and so forth. And the remedies proposed were completely wrong-headed, right? I mean, Paul Ehrlich openly argued for coercive birth control, and it was practiced in a few nations like India, China still today, of course. And we, wow, that's really cool. I gotta get that. Anyway, I think we're going to look back on climate change. The world, there's not too much controversy, even among the deep skeptics, that the world has warmed in the 20th century. There are some lingering questions as to how much. Our temperature record is still a little shaky, it turns out. And then the question going forward is how much more could we expect it to warm? And that's where I think the debate is changing in real time on basic climate sensitivity. And so there is powerful institutional momentum behind the climate campaign. However, I think you can see the cracks all over the place. The Copenhagen conference ended pretty much in failure on their own terms. They'll always spin it as a success, but it was a grand failure compared to the original intentions of it. Australia, which has a fairly left-leaning Labour government that was all for making climate one of their top priorities, has just announced it's postponing for at least 2 years its emissions trading program that they think is so essential to saving the planet. And when Australia bails out, that's a sign that the political support for this was either never there in the first place, or when it really came down to brass tacks would erode fairly quickly. Europe is starting to roll back in some of these things. I mean, those folks talk a great game, but notice that Spain and Germany are starting to cancel or scale back some of their subsidies for alternative energy that are quite ridiculous. Just to give you one example, Germany subsidizes solar power. I don't know why there's solar power in Germany. They don't have a lot of sun there. I've seen some of their solar installations. They're really ridiculous. But they subsidize to the tune of 45 cents a kilowatt hour. If you haven't scrutinized your electricity bill, even here with Pepco or Dominion in the suburbs, I don't know what DC is. DC Pepco? I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyway, if you look at your Pepco and Dominion power bills, which tend to be a little on the higher side than, say, Indiana or Ohio, well, we pay as consumers, between 12 and 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So the Germans are paying 3 times as much as we pay for electricity. And no wonder they're going to scale back on this. They can't afford electricity at that price, even with all the electricity light bulbs. With that, I think I will go. Let's look at a few websites, though. Those of you who follow energy and environment, I mean, there's a lot of good sites out there. But the ones that I think are the best on climate begins with a site called Climate Debate Daily. Some of the really fun work that's been done by people who expose the hockey stick. Anthony Watts has a site that I really like called What's Up With That. Oh, Mark Morano, some of you no doubt know him from his days working for Senator Imhoff, has this wonderful site called climatedepot.com. Steve McIntyre is one of the Canadians who really broke the story about what was wrong with the the hockey stick. He has a site called Climate Audit, that is very much worth bookmarking and looking at from time to time whenever you're writing about climate subjects. And then finally, I hope I have Bishop Hill up here. So on your list, Bishop Hill, yeah, there he is. Bishop Hill is a guy who's also worked very hard on getting into the weeds on the technical aspects of climate models and the climate data. And he's got terrific information that goes on his website on a regular basis. Now, and then finally, the fun one, especially for those of you who write for something like the Examiner and stuff like that, is a what's called the warm list. Here's the complete list of things caused by global warming. Teenage acne's in here, right? Cat allergies, all kinds of things. And every one of these is a link to some news article or study that says climate change causes this. And it causes everything, right? I should say a couple more things about energy and just talk about a couple of the myths of the whole energy business that drive me out of my mind. So, for example, last week I was on the Kudlow show on CNBC with the new executive director of the Sierra Club, and he says, oil drilling is dangerous. That's why we need to invest more in alternative energy like wind power and solar power. And I sort of stopped for a minute and thought, I haven't seen a car yet that can run on a windmill. They need fuel. They need, liquid fuel. Ditto with solar power. These ingenious engineers will design these solar-powered cars that can race across Australia where it's really sunny and hot. But they cost a couple $100,000 to make. They're not exactly affordable. They wouldn't work very well in most real-world conditions. So you try and clear this up, but this is an important point. Leaving aside for the moment the difficulties of wind and solar power or what their scalability might be, you can't run cars on them. We are, at best, at least 10 years away from having battery technology that would make electric cars really practical, and I'm doubtful even that can be achieved for a very simple reason. You're up against some of the barriers of physics. To make a battery have the same energy as a gallon of gasoline, you've got to put so many electrons in it. That's what battery technology is an electron storage device. That by the time you get the same amount of electrons in it to make it equivalent of gasoline, essentially you have a weapon called a bomb. This is why, by the way, batteries in some of these computers, the lithium-ion batteries get hot, and you've had a few cases of them exploding. Put a great big one in a car and see what happens. People are working on this. I will add, by the way, though, if you're worried about energy security and we decide we can make this work with lithium-ion batteries, guess who has most of the lithium in the world? It turns out to be Bolivia, which doesn't like us this week. Maybe in 10 years we'll change all that, but who knows? The point is we're going to have to import the material for it if you do that on a very large scale. So this is an important point to keep in mind, is that oil is used almost exclusively as a transportation fuel for our cars, our trucks, our locomotives, and our airplanes. So we can build nuclear power plants like crazy. We can put solar panels on everything, and it wouldn't change by a single drop the amount of oil we need to import. And even if you have electric cars developed that are better 10 years from now, well, that means at the best case we'd be using oil for at least another 30 years, because most new cars these days will last about 20 years. And no one's going to turn in their car that's still in working order for a new one that's going to cost more anyway. So we're going to be using oil for a very long time. The amount of electricity you'd have to generate, in addition to what we generate now, to power electric cars is immense. What we're talking about is shutting down coal-fired power plants, right? They're the cheapest. So, yeah, you could charge a few with windmills and solar cells, but nobody has done the math on that. That's another aspect of this that is completely unserious. Thank you, that's a good point. I meant to make that. EIA.doe.gov. There we are. The Energy Information Administration, and you go through these tabs here, they have reams and reams and reams of data. It was going through their data tables. I forget which tab you find it there. Their energy outlooks are actually pretty good documents, and loads and loads of data. I'm a data maven, so I love this stuff. It was going through their historical documents that I figured out what the Wall Street Journal mentioned one more time yesterday, being very kind to me in an editorial, that when you look at the Waxman-Markey bill or the Kerry-Lieberman bill, they both say they want to reduce CO2 emissions in the US by 80%, 80, by the year 2050, 40 years out from now. And it took some doing because the data series they don't match up, and you have to do a little bit of second order math on this, but it's not hard, it's pretty straightforward. The last time we had CO2 emissions 80% below where they are today, William Howard Taft was president. It's about 1910. Or maybe even as early as 1905, but I sort of estimated up a little bit to not overstate the point, as though that weren't overstatement enough. But that's not the end of the story. In 1910, we had 92 million people. So the next question I asked was, when was the last time per capita emissions in the US were 2.4 tons? That's the figure we have to get to, it turns out. And there the data is a little sketchier, but looks pretty solid that the last time we had 2.4 tons of CO2 per person was about 1875. And maybe never, by the way. I think it's possible, depending on how you do the carbon accounting, that we emitted 2.4 tons per person or more in 1776 when all we burned was wood to keep us warm. It used to be billions and billions of cubic feet of wood a year in this country as late as 1905. And whale oil, I suppose. We burned a lot of that, I know. We could go back to that, I suppose. Now, I think just to sort of finish that story, those of you who follow the climate debate at all will probably observe that any time you make a factual claim or an interpretive claim that is contrary to the climate narrative, the climate campaign goes berserk, denounces you for being wrong, trots out 5 counter-arguments and 10 studies and so forth. Now, the analysis I just gave you about rolling back our emissions to 100 years ago in a 40-year time period, I have presented that analysis repeatedly to congressional committees, on TV, to all kinds of audiences, and the climate campaigners changed the subject. I haven't once been challenged about this, which to me is sort of an inconvenient truth, I guess you might say it is. And the people on the congressional committees, the liberals who are all for this, they sort of look dumbfounded and then give the usual cliches about innovation and things of this kind.
What, if any, effect does the Gulf oil spill have on our national energy policy?
Well, I don't think it's going to help very much. You were beginning to see public opinion start to support more domestic oil exploration and production. And now with all the scary headlines, I think a lot of people are going to draw away from it. I think that's unfortunate because it means we will increase our imported oil. That's bad for our dependency on the Middle East. It's also probably bad for the environment because tanker spills account for much more oil spills than offshore oil platforms do. But the public doesn't understand that, and our politicians in Washington don't understand that. So if we increase importing oil by tanker, we'll have more oil spilled in the ocean in all likelihood.
Do you think we'll get a bigger movement or push towards renewable resources energy?
Well, there's I don't know how much bigger the push for renewable energy could possibly be. Everyone seems to be for it. The environmentalists are for it, but a lot of big businesses for it because the government will subsidize it. So at some point, though, like other sort of socialist ventures, you run out of other people's money. And other countries that have been ahead of us in subsidizing alternative energy, like Germany and Spain, and even England, are starting to scale those subsidies back because they can't afford them. So there are severe limits to how far we can go down that road.
And how does this all affect climate change policy?
Well, climate change policy was already in deep trouble because it turns out to be very expensive to meet these hugely ambitious targets. And no one really wants to deliver that kind of hit to our economy. I think what's interesting to note is that other nations are drawing back from their grand climate policy plans, like Australia is postponing its climate policy. You'll see in England and Germany and other European nations are drawing back from their ambitious climate policy. So I think this subject's not going to go away, but I think you're starting to see the tide turn on climate craziness, as I call it.
Do you think there will be a climate bill passed in Congress this year?
I don't think it's going to pass in Congress this year. I think between health care and some of the other things Congress has done, there's not much appetite to pass an expensive climate bill.